Hey, what's up, YouTube fans? So I wanted to talk about in this video, right, is something else that is helpful evidence towards the evolution of tetrapods from fish, right, is developmental evidence, right? So all vertebrates, right, including tetrapods such as humans, right? We in our earliest stages of, or well, not most early, but in our very early stages of development, we start out in a state where we look much more like a fish than a tetrapod, right? We start out having pharyngeal arches and pharyngeal slits, which resemble gills in their structure, right? And in fish, they actually develop into being gills, right? Whereas in us, it develops into totally separate things, right? It rearranges more so further into development and becomes totally separate things. And in our early stages of development, we have fish-like tails, even though us humans, we don't have tails, right? Because we're hominoids, right? Apes. And so we don't have tails, right? Post-birth, right? But in our early stages of development, we have tails, right? And this is most prominently seen in amphibians, right? Because amphibians such as frogs, right? Even though they're, even after they're already out of the egg, right? They spend a long period of time in a state where they much more look like a fish than like a frog, right? They actually more so resemble a fish than a frog. And you could easily mistake them for a fish if you didn't know better. Especially some tadpoles, which are particularly big in some frog species, they could easily be mistaken for a fish, right? They look mostly identical to a fish. They look much more like a fish than a seahorse looks like a fish, even though a seahorse actually is a fish, right? And they look much more like a fish than they look like a frog, right? But they eventually transform into a frog, right? And so, even though the transformation from fish to tetrapod could seem like this surreal transformation that almost seems like some comic book story that's like an unrealistic transformation, the transformation of the body itself from a fish-like state to a tetrapod state, that's not something that just is like millions of years in the past. That's something that's observed all the time, right? The transformation of the body itself, that part is observed all the time. The part of it that is deep in the past, right, is the transformation of the genetic instructions for building the body parts, but not the transformation of the body parts themselves, right? And then also with salamanders, they have the ability to regrow limbs, right? And their limbs have the same fundamental structure as our limbs, right? And they have the ability to regrow them just like how we can regrow hair. They can regrow whole limbs, right? And so, it could come off. They could regrow it, right? Because the DNA has the instructions for how to build it, right? So the bodily transformation, that part of it is the most difficult to visualize, but it's the part of it that's observed all the time, right? And so the part that's hundreds of millions of years in the past and not observed all the time is the transformation of the genetic instructions. So that's important to understand for anyone that like just can't visualize the transition from fish to tetrapod and therefore think it doesn't make sense, it could seem difficult to like grasp at first, right? But when you understand things like this, it really isn't like it really doesn't like seem unrealistic, right? All right, that's all for now. See you guys.